Hi everyone and welcome to this Fan Arts Friday video. This time I want to work on a drawing of the female Titan from Attack on Titan. I love working on these Titan drawings, they're so much fun and I really enjoy reattempting these after a couple of years. A couple of years ago I worked on a few different Titans, and back then that's when I just started using Copic markers, so it's awesome now to reattempt them after a couple of years of progress and developing my own kind of style with the comic panel in the background and an environment and the effect with the particles and the new steam effect that I love using. I've been including that in a lot of my drawings recently, and I definitely want to include that in this one. So, while I was working on the initial sketch and the pen outlines, for the layout I decided to work on a side portrait. I initially worked on a sketch before this, where I worked on a much more zoomed in version, focusing on her face, but I wasn't happy with this because it really took out the ability to work on any kind of environment in the background and any kind of comic panel really. So I decided to work on a much more zoomed out version that also gave me the opportunity to work on more of her hair, and that ended up taking a huge amount of time when I was working on the pen outlines because I wanted to make sure those lines were as smooth as possible. For the pen outlines I was using a Copic Multiliner SP 0.03mm, and as always the entire outlining process ended up taking maybe 3 hours in total, so much longer with this pen, but I really do feel like it's absolutely worth it for the end result, keeping those lines as smooth as I possibly can. Once I eventually completed the outlines, it was then time to work on the colouring, and for the colouring of this drawing I used Copic markers, starting off with her skin tones. I used pinkish white first, adding a couple of layers with this, making sure that colouring was as smooth as possible. Then over the top of that, to add a warmer tone, I used a pale heath marker. Then, to add some extra shading underneath her hair and nose and mouth and those areas, I used a mixture of pale grape and light grape. For the colouring of her lips, I started with a base layer of colour with pale grape. Then over the top of that, I blended some tender pink and rose red. To the upper lip, I wanted to add some darker shading, so I blended some light grape over the top of that as well. And then to lighten the colouring on her lower lip, I used a blush marker over the top. To add some highlighting to the lips, I also used a white Prismacolor pencil. After this, I decided that I really wanted to add some extra shading around her face. So for this, I used my Cool Grey markers, starting with Cool Grey 7 and 5, adding some extremely dark shading underneath her hair, nose and mouth. Then after this, I blended downwards from that shading with my Cool Grey 3 marker. And the awesome thing about placing this shading was that it then allowed me to add some highlighting with my white Prismacolor pencil that would help to define some of the shapes, and I love the effect this gives, and it really helps to show up some of the details that would have been kind of hidden beforehand. Just adding that little bit of shading and then adding some highlighting over the top of it just helps to add more depth, and it gives me more control over the details that I want to show up. For the colouring of her eye, for the iris I used a mixture of ice blue, sky blue and Prussian blue, just blending between those three colours. Then for the white of the eye I used a mixture of Cool Grey 5, 3 and 1. Then over the top of this, to add some bright highlights, I used my Uniball Signo Broad white ink pen. Then it was time for me to work on the visible muscle fibres around her eye. And my process for creating any of the muscle fibres around this drawing was to start off with the crimson marker first, adding a full layer of colour with this. Then over the top of that, using a cardinal marker to add some darker colouring and to start developing some of the shapes. Over the top of that, with the colouring added, I then start placing the shading down with a black, Cool Grey 7 and Cool Grey 5 markers, starting with the black and then blending outwards with Cool Grey 7 and 5 in that order. And just using them to develop the shape, but not adding shading throughout the entire area, leaving some areas without shading so that they really stand out. Then after that, placing some streaks of highlighting with the white Prismacolor pencil, and then adding some dots of highlights with the highlighter pen to add a nice shiny reflective texture to this area that really contrasts the texture of the skin. And I also then made sure to use the highlighter pen to add some extra details around her face. Once I was happy with the colouring of her face, it was then time to work on the colouring of her hair. For this, I started with a milky white marker first, adding some highlighted sections towards the front of her face, and then for the rest of the colouring of the hair, I added a full layer of colouring with light reddish yellow. To add some darker areas of shading towards the back, towards the right side of the drawing, I used a mixture of warm grey 3 and 5. And throughout this entire process I was making sure to add the colouring in the direction of the hair as well to add to the texture. And as usual I made sure to add some streaks of highlighting with the highlighter pen. Also, for the hair in the background, I added the same light reddish yellow first, and then blended some warm grey 7 over the top. I used the same colouring process for the muscle fibres on her neck, but this is a much more shaded area, so I made more use of the black marker this time. But I did make sure to use the highlighter pen to add that really cool shiny texture. Then for the tendons and the ligaments on her neck and shoulder, I added a base layer of colour with warm grey 1, 3 and 5, and then added some actual shading to the area with cool grey 3 and 5. Then to help define some of the shapes amongst the shading, I also used the white Prismacolor pencil and the highlighter pen. With the colouring of the female Titan completed, it was then time to work on the final stages of this drawing, with the background and the environment effects around her. So I started with the base layers of colour in the background first, adding the trees with the champagne marker and the colour in between them with a pea green marker. For the next layer in front of this, I wanted to create a cloud of steam, so I used a 6B pencil and added a block of shading first, using a blending stick to keep it nice and smooth. Then over the top of that I used a small eraser to add some highlighted edges, just creating a layered steam effect. I love using this process, and I feel like it's a great way to fade the details of the Titan towards the bottom of the drawing. After that, I continued by adding some environment effects with a mixture of the highlighter pen and some Prismacolor pencils, just adding some lines sweeping right across the image. I also then added some particle effects with the highlighter pen, some Copic markers and the 6B pencil, just adding some general movement in the image with a bunch of different particles everywhere. And then for the last touch I added a highlight going all the way around the Titan. And after that, this drawing was completed. Overall, it took about 6 hours to complete in total, and I had a huge amount of fun working on this one. With a lot of the drawings recently, I feel like I've learnt a lot with the new processes, with the steam effects and the particles and that kind of thing. And I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you for encouraging me to try these new things. I really appreciate it. So if you have any suggestions for future drawing videos, if you'd like to see more drawings like this, or if you'd like to see more fantasy art, or fan art, or tutorials, any suggestions at all, please let me know. If you want to see more drawing videos, then make sure to subscribe, and any likes or shares on this video, they really mean a lot to me. If you want to follow my progress and keep updated with all the things I work on through the week, then be sure to check out the links in the description box below to check out my Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. And once again, thank you so much for the support, and thank you so much for watching this. I loved working on this one, and I can't wait to work on the next. I hope you're having an awesome day, and I'll see you all soon.